Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for today's webinar, A Geographical Perspective on the Numbered Treaties in Canada by Connie, Wyatt, Anderson. My name is Jessica Knapp, and I am the Online Engagement Coordinator for Canada's History Society. The Treaties and the Treaty Relationship webinar series is a collaboration between Canada's History Society and the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. Joining me as co-host for today's webinar on behalf of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba is Cynthia Bird. As many of you will recall, Cynthia discussed in a previous webinar the history of treaty making and the significance of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. I am adding the link in the chat so you can check that out later if you haven't seen it already. For those of you who do not know Cynthia, she is a Cree educator from the Peguis First Nation in Manitoba and Treaty 1 territory. She has 34 years of work experience in community education, research involving urban Aboriginal homelessness, Indigenous curriculum development, and group facilitation processes. Currently, she is advisor to the Treaty Education Initiative and lives in Treaty 7 territory in Calgary. I welcome Cynthia.
Thank you, Jessica, for that kind introduction. I would just like to tell you a bit about the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. It is a neutral body that was created through a partnership with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and Canada, specifically Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, with a mandate to strengthen, rebuild, and enhance the treaty relationship and mutual respect between First Nations and Manitobans, as envisioned by the treaty parties. For more on the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, I invite you to go to our website at trcm.ca. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Canada's History Society is dedicated to promoting greater popular interest in Canadian history, principally through our publishing, education, and recognition programs. I invite you to learn more about Canada's History Society and our work by visiting our website at canadashistory.ca. And I've sent the link to you there as well. For the best experience possible, today, I encourage you to close down any unnecessary programs your computer may be running, like Photoshop or Spotify. Oh, I forgot to mention that both Canada's History Society and the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba are on social media. If you are interested in extending today's conversation on Facebook or Twitter, feel free to mention us or use the hashtag #TreatyHistory. I would also like to remind viewers that if you need to increase the volume of the presentation, please use the computer volume controls in addition to Adobe Connect's controls. However, if you do have any technical issues today, a recording of today's webinar will be available in the next few days. And if you have registered for today's webinar or the Treaty webinar series in full, you will receive an email with a link to that recording. If you have any questions during today's webinar, I welcome you to share them at any time, but please know that Connie may wait until the end to answer them. Very good.
So with that, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. It's exciting for the Treaty Commission and the Historical Society to be working together on this initiative. And today I'd like to introduce Connie is a long-time educator. She teaches high school history and geography. Her experience has been with the Opaskwayak Cree Nation since 1992, and recently joined the University College of the North in the Paw, Manitoba. So we're excited that she's had a long association with the Treaty Commission too, since around 2010, and what she brings with her is many years of experience in creating student learning materials and curricula at the provincial, national, and international level. And she's contributed to a number of textbooks, teacher support guides, and school publications. She has also co-authored the grade 11 history text that's used in Manitoba schools and is in the process of writing a grade 9 geography textbook for Ontario. So for all her work, she has received several recognitions, and one of them is the governor of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. She sits on that society. She's also chair of its education wing, the Canadian Geographic Education Wing. So in her role, she represents the entirety of the Canadian Geographic Education as a national organization and represents Canada on the Education Alliance of National Geographic in the U.S. Connie has been a co-writer of the Treaty Education Learning Materials for the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba and has been involved in the professional development of Manitoba educational leaders and teachers as part of the Treaty Education Initiative. I've been excited to call her a colleague through this past number of years. She holds a Bachelor of Education degree and recently completed a Master's of Education in Curricula and Instruction. She received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, which was presented by the Royal Canadian Geographical Society in 2012. She was also a finalist in the 2013 Governor General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching. And more recently, in 2014, she was honored by the Aboriginal Circle of Educators Award for her work with the Treaty Relations Commission. Please join me in welcoming Connie as presenter today. Welcome, Connie.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. This is Connie. Everybody can hear me, I'm assuming, I hope. And I think Jessica is getting the presentation ready. So welcome everybody from across the country. I'm tuning in today from the Paw, Manitoba. I'm wondering if we have anybody here from the eastern part of our country today. Might have some folks from Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba. So it looks like, oh, there we go. Thank you, Jessica. Well, welcome everybody. I want to thank you again very much. This is Connie. My name is Connie Wyatt Anderson. Thank you very much, Cynthia, for the kind overview. So I'm really happy to have everybody here today, and I hope everybody can hear me and all is well. What we're going to do today, we're going to look at the numbered treaties here in Canada, but we're going to take a geographic perspective at looking at the treaties. Cynthia described that my background is teaching high school history and geography. My background is teaching both and curriculum development in both. So for the next few minutes that we spend together here, I'd like to provide a geographical perspective on the numbered treaties, as I said. I'd like to take a look at where the numbered treaties are located. We're going to explore traditional Indigenous place names, and I'm going to tell you about some new and upcoming projects that are going on here in our country. I'd like to take a look at traditional territory acknowledgement statements. And before we finish our presentation today, I would like to take a look at the learning resources that are found in the Treaty Education Kit. Cynthia talked about the Treaty Education Initiative, and she talked about the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. And the kit is one of the ways that here in Manitoba, we have supported the implementation of teaching treaties in our schools. So before we go any further, we're taking a geographic perspective. I want to take a look at a few quotes that have to do with geography. You know, being a geography teacher, we always hear about the capes and bays approach, where I'm expected to memorize, 100 countries' capitals. Let's look at these quotes. Geography is the place where history happens. Latitudes, not attitudes. Geography explains history. They're intricately related. An atlas is like a long-term forecast. It sees history before it happens. And here are the three uber important questions for inquiry when you're approaching something from a geographic perspective. What is where? Why there? Why care? So if we take a look at that, if we take a look at the what is where, why there, why care, this comes from geographer Charles Gritzner out of the University of South Dakota. And Gritzner claimed, and this has been a way that we've developed geography curricula in Manitoba and other jurisdictions for quite a while now. Geography really asks 3 questions. Geography doesn't ask you to memorize capital cities, or geography doesn't ask you to memorize the height of a mountain. It asks you to think globally. It asks you, number 1, what is where? Where are features located on the earth? The feature could be a man-made feature. It could be something like the province of Ontario. It could be a natural feature like the Rocky Mountains. But what is where? It could be where population is distributed. Then what we ask, when we're asking students to inquire into a geographic issue or a geographic problem, why there? Why are the mountains where they are? Let's say some of my friends, maybe you're from British Columbia tuning in, why are mountains there? I told you I live in the Paw, Manitoba. We have what we call here in Manitoba, the Manitoba Escarpment. Why? Why is population in Canada centered along the American border? Why there? And when you think about a 21st century education, Gritzner always said too, the next thing you want kids to look at, when you're looking at a geographic perspective, what is where, why there, and maybe the most important is why care? What's the importance? What's the relevance? What is the reaction, the action? So today, when we're looking at the numbered treaties here in Canada, we are going to be using Charles Gritzner's exploration of the numbered treaties using the what is where, why there, why care. That's the geographic perspective. So let's start off. The first thing we're going to look at is what is where. Where are the numbered treaties? And what you see in front of you here is a map of Canada. You see a map of Canada, and between 1871 and 1921, there were 11 numbered treaties negotiated between the Crown, the Canadian government, and First Nations in Canada, various nations in Canada. They're called numbered treaties because, as you can see from the map, they're numbered. Beginning in 1871, you can see in southern Manitoba, southeastern Manitoba, you can see number 2, number 3, smattering across the west and north, mostly, of Canada, right? These treaties encompass an area from present-day Ontario to Alberta to portions of British Columbia and the Northwest Territories. So a very large geographic area of Canada is where we see the numbered treaties. That is what is where. So let's take a look a bit closer. Let's take a look a bit closer. What I did here, we zoomed in now. Let's see. And I heard Cynthia talking about treaty number 6, and I heard Jessica talking about treaty number 1 when she's talking about areas. Treaty number 1 is located in south central Manitoba. So again, we're looking at what is where, and you can see it's the blue area. And if you're today here in Winnipeg, maybe some of our friends are tuned in today from Winnipeg, Brandon, Portage Prairie, Lundar, Emerson, Winkler. You are in Treaty 1 area. You are in Treaty 1 area. Treaty was signed in 1871, you can see. So what is where? Let's locate ourselves on the land. Let's just take a look at Treaty 4. So Treaty 4 now, Treaty 4 is interesting. Look at how you can see Treaty 2. And I just picked some of them. I mean, we only have so much time today. Treaty 4, the large part of Treaty 4 is what we call today Saskatchewan. However, there's a small part in what we call Manitoba. So you can see right away, if I was introducing this to students, treaty boundaries supersede whatever our provincial boundaries are. There are Manitoba communities, that are part of Treaty 4. Communities like Swan River, Birch River, Mafeking. You can see how it ebbs into Manitoba. We have communities in Saskatchewan that fall into Treaty 4. And maybe this is you, my friends, in Saskatchewan, Weyburn, Moose Jaw. We have a small area, and you can see the Cypress Hills in Alberta also. So again, from a geographic perspective, let's find ourselves. Let's find ourselves geographically using the treaties, the treaty areas. I can go to Treaty 6 now. So I'm hopping around, you can see. Treaty 6 represents most of central area of Saskatchewan and Alberta. You can see that. You can see a treaty adhesion with the 1889 there. Okay? Some of the larger Saskatchewan communities that share in the benefit and obligations of Treaty number 6 include places like Saskatoon, Prince Albert, Edmonton, red deer. So again, what we're doing here is we are finding our place. We are finding our place on a map. And again, I told you my background is teaching history and geography. I can't imagine teaching history without a map. Again, if we just pick another treaty, we're not going to go over all 11 of them. We can pick up treaty number 9. And treaty number 9 is a very large area. It covers almost 2/3 of what later became Northern Ontario. You know, and it became Ontario the size that it is much later. I mean, 1867, we became a country, covers most of present-day Ontario. You can see some of the communities who share, and this is an important thing, in the benefit and obligations of Treaty Number 9. And they include communities such as Moose Factory, Timmins, Kapuskasing. You'll notice when I put this PowerPoint together, I listed non-First Nations communities because I wanted to show that the relationship extends to other communities in that treaty area. Again, we're using what is where as our approach. Treaty number 11 is the last of the numbered treaties, signed in 1921. It is a huge area, and treaty negotiations, treaties are evergreen. I mean, this map represents things from that time. Covers 950,000 square kilometers. You can see Fort Simpson and Yellowknife are both in what we would call treaty number 11 area. So what we did with the first part of our session today, we are looking at, you know, what is where? Where are the numbered treaties? And what we did, we found them on a map of Canada. We found them on a map of Canada. We looked at Treaty 1, we looked at Treaty 4. So the next geographic question, and I invite questions if anybody wants to, by all means, we could ask ourselves then, so what is where? We've placed ourselves. Our next geographic question would be, why there? Why, if you look at treaty number 1, my friends, and if you take a look, you can see the blue at the bottom of Manitoba, the number 1, and the 1871 in brackets, and you can see how it spans out, you know, like a fan in some ways across a huge territory that is Canada today. We want to ask ourselves what was happening politically at that time in what I'll call Canada. And you can see the map, you can see an image of John A. Macdonald, who was Canada's first Prime Minister. And you can also see 1867, 1867, 1867. Well, since time immemorial, Indigenous peoples lived on this land that we call Canada today. Starting in the late 1400s, 1497, with people like John Cabot, and then into the 1500s, we have the French and the English primarily coming to what we call Canada today. Over years and years and years, you know, through jockeying between mostly French and English, and different colonies are established. By 1867, July 1st, Canada becomes a country. Canada becomes a country in 1867, hence the 1867. Canada was a collection of British colonies at this time. And in 1867, you had 4 colonies only. That's why there's only 4 1867s there, agree to join Canada. They thought it was a good enough idea. Those 4 colonies were Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Colonies like Newfoundland, colonies like Prince Edward Island, and weren't interested. Colonies like British Columbia, you have to cast your gaze a bit to the left, didn't see the benefit of joining this country called Canada. All the land in the middle, where we see the treaty relationship from the numbered treaties perspective, the bulk majority of that land was owned, had been taken over from 1670 onward by the Hudson's Bay Company. So what happens is, after 1867, one of the major goals of the founders of Confederation, the fathers of Confederation, is to expand west. So why there? Why do we have a treaty relationship there? What had just happened now, we have to think about what had happened in the United States. From 1861 to 1865, we had the North and the South, the blue and the gray, the American Civil War. We have an aggressive neighbor in the 1860s living south to us, who is beginning at the height of their manifest destiny. Canada, at the same time, wants to expand west. They're fully cognizant of what's going on in the United States. They're fully cognizant of the wars between the Indigenous nations in the United States and the American government. So in many ways, Canada sees, why there? They see a treaty relationship as a way for peaceful expansion. Why there? Why 1871? Manitoba joins in 1870. Rarely are things in history or even on a map a fluke. It tells a story. Why there? Canada's expanding west. Why there? The Hudson's Bay Company sold all that land out from everybody, I suppose, on your perspective, in 1870 to the Canadian government. Why there? The Americans at the time, I told you, are in the height, or at the beginning of, after the Civil War ends in 65, of their expansionism here in the North American continent. This affects the treaties and the treaty relationship that is to come forward. At the same time, in 1867 now, if Treaty 1 was signed in 1871, Canada had become a dominion. Within the British Empire, July 1st, 1867. So what this means, so what's a dominion? A dominion, from a legislative purpose, from our point of view in Canada, means that the Canadian government had control over its internal affairs, its domestic affairs. Canada could build a railway. Canada could engage in treaties with Indigenous peoples in what is going to be Canada. Canada could not make a trade deal with a foreign country. This doesn't happen until 1931, when we get control of our external affairs. But when we became a country in 1867, in our documents, if you look, there are terms relevant to Western treaty making. One was the purchase of Rupert's Land in the whole Northwestern Territories, which is where I told you I'm in the Paw, Manitoba right now. This was, at different mapping times, was also called the Paw Northwest Territories. Another thing in the BNA Act, which is Canada's birth certificate from 1867, there was specifically areas of the British North America Act, and you can see where the federal government, and I'm using their words, have jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved to Indians. So why are the numbered treaties where they are speaks largely to how Canada is starting to grow as a country by pushing westward. Why there? If we think of the treaty map in your head, At the same time, the Canadian government wants to establish itself in the West, but they don't want Canada to be a fur trading colony anymore. The fur trade has started to wane. They want to keep the Americans out, and they want to establish themselves in a heavier footprint on the land. And what is going to happen is that the Canadian government is going to actively advertise in Europe. You can see some of the posters. These are primary resources. They are actively advertising in Europe for European farmers. They want a farming class of folk to come here. I mean, if you read documents by different immigration officials at the time, they blatantly state they don't want urban people. They want, a Eastern European farmer, and I always get a chuckle out of this word, with a stout wife. But you can see this. And to the government now, to the Canadian government, prospective Indigenous people who've lived in this land since time immemorial, were partners in a fur trade for a couple hundred years, are now in some ways an obstacle to the Canadian government, who wants to push west and build an agricultural economy. Again, you can see images here. You can also see there's an image of the last spike. All of this stuff is happening at the same time. The railway is being built, treaties are being signed. This is part of Johnny MacDonald's national policy. The Northwest Mounted Police are established in 1873. So why are the treaties? Why there? Because it's speaking to larger things that is going on politically, socially, economically, internationally. What is where? Why there? Why are the numbered treaties where they are? Remember our geographic placing. So I told you today we were going to look at, where the treaties are, the numbered treaties, why they're there. And I also wanted to spend some time on Indigenous place names. Why there? Indigenous place names. You already heard me mention words like Saskatchewan and Manitoba. I mean, these are Indigenous place names that have become part of our landscape here in Canada. And Indigenous place names are extremely important. Long before Europeans came here, long before there was a Canada, long before there was a Manitoba, long before there was an Alberta, First Nations and Inuit peoples gave names to their places all across this land, and they identified the land. And the names, just like your name, just like your own name, whether it be your last name, your middle name, your first name, your nickname, it told a rich story and had strong spiritual connections. For years, I've done workshops for different organizations, and a good friend of mine taught me a game that I do often with my session participants, and he called it the name game. And I ask people, where'd you get your name? And some of you, if you work with people, if you work with students or teachers, it's a wonderful activity, because people tell you very often a little bit about themselves. Indigenous place names and the names they assigned to the landscape were very important. For centuries, they described natural features, commemorated significant historical events passed from one generation to the next. Indigenous place names honored the past as also a way to document Indigenous heritage. And you're seeing lots of movements today, and I find it very interesting, moving back to traditional Indigenous place names. Traditional Indigenous place names. If we take a look here, and this is one of the maps produced by the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Centre. I understand it's very small, and it is a traditional First Nation community names map of here in Manitoba, is what it is. You can't see it, but it talks about Cree communities, Dene communities, and the richness of traditional names. What I did, I enlarged the area in which I live a bit. You can see different communities. This map is very hard to see, I realize. You can see Opaskwayak. Opaskwayak is the First Nation community that I taught in for 20-some years. Thank you, Jessica. I mean, for a long time, these names have been wiped off maps by mapping authorities in Canada, and there has been a real move to bring these Indigenous place names back, because the richness, again, of the stories that they tell us. If I take a look, and if I go to the next page, and we're still taking a look at, I picked Cree communities, and you'll be able to see a little bit of this. If I look at a community like, forgive me, I'm scooting around. You can see in brackets the communities like Oxford House, Easterville, Norway House, Brochet, Fox Lake, and then you can see the Cree name, and then you can see the interpretation from the traditional name, and they're very rich interpretations. Much of it speaks to spirituality, much of it speaks to place where the rivers cross, where rivers run through, talks about birch, and it explains a lot about a people's land-based culture. It explains a lot about a people's land-based culture. You notice in very many communities, and I found it interesting, even if you recall, if you're as old as I am, when the Soviet Union crumbled in the early 90s, how so many countries sought to rename themselves, sought to spell things the way they had spelled them, not from somebody else. I told you that I live in the Pas, Manitoba, and the Pas has a long history with Indigenous peoples. North side of the river is mostly the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. And for years and years, the Pas, who's First Nations people who signed treaty, the Cree, who signed Treaty Number 5, this territory was called the Pas Reserve. Very shortly before I came to teach here, you can see the official notice. They changed the name to the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. And you can see this is a band council resolution dated from 93. The chief and council of Opaskwayak Cree Nation, the name of their band from the Pas Indian Band to the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, okay? Because it was not derived from the forefathers of our people. So the place, what things are called, why things are there, tell a rich history. So geographic perspective rounds out a historical perspective, and that sometimes we forget to take a look at when we're exploring the past. Before I go on, I'd share with you an exciting project that is on the docket here in Canada. The Geographical Names Board of Canada is collaborating with Natural Resources Canada. These are both federal departments here. They're producing a Indigenous place names map of Canada. So it's going to be a Canadian map, not a Manitoba map. They're producing an Indigenous place names of map. It's going to represent over 40 Indigenous languages, and they're offering it as a traditional paper map as well as an interactive web map, and it's going to be unveiled early this summer for Canada's 150th anniversary celebrations. And I find it very interesting as we come upon Canada's 150th anniversary as a country, July 1st, 2017, I've seen all kinds of rich things coming forward. They say in 1967, when we celebrated our 100th anniversary, I've heard this more than once, that Canada looked outward, looked to the world and said, hello, we're 100, we're Canada. This is who we are. We aren't a British colony. This is 1967. Well, they say, and again, I've been doing quite a bit of research and reading, in 2017, as Canadians, especially when I think about the release of things like the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Canadians are looking in. Canadians are looking in, and I really think, keep your eyes and ears out. This is going to be a wonderful resource for teachers, for parents, for communities. So again, it's going to be a Indigenous place names map of Canada, telling the unique story. So far, and again, taking a geographic perspective, we've looked at what is where. You know, where are the numbered treaties? We looked at maps. Why there? We talked about how Canada became a country in 1867. We spent a bit of time looking at Indigenous place names. I also wanted to touch on territorial acknowledgement statements. This is something that we've been seeing here in Canada for not a very long time, the last few years. An increasing number of institutions across Canada, and by institutions I mean schools, businesses, sporting clubs, are starting to make verbal land acknowledgements to the Indigenous groups who occupied the territory before there was a Canada, before there was a Calgary, before there was a Nova Scotia. These are brief reminders of our history. And they're tucked into the routines of everyday life. You know, if you go to a Winnipeg Jets game, there is a territorial acknowledgement statement as to whose territory this is. Oftentimes, but not always, these territorial acknowledgement statements recognize the treaty area. People may say, you know, I'm on Treaty 1 land. I'm on Treaty 6 land. What I did for here, I just clipped, and I'm not going to read them all to you, 3 of them show you in different areas. Here's a university from Hearst, Ontario, that is recognizing that they exist on Treaty 9 territory. The University of Manitoba, and we talked about Treaty 1, is in the heart of Treaty 1 land. It's recognizing they are on Treaty 1. University of Alberta, you can see, is Treaty 6. So as time goes forward, we are seeing this more and more and more. You can see this as a small step forward or a large step forward, but at least in my view, it is a dialogue. Why care? Because we're moving into a different time when it comes to geography, when it comes to acknowledging our past, and looking forward to really a shared future for all Canadians. One of the other goals of my presentation today was to share with you some of the materials that are available in the Treaty Education Kit. Cynthia talked about the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. The Treaty Education Initiative is the education arm, is the education initiative of the TRCM. And it is an education initiative meant for all students in Manitoba. It is Manitoba focused, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't be used in Alberta or Ontario. Many organizations there have similar initiatives. The kit is, as you can see a bunch of books here, right? You can see a bunch of books. Imagine a box, a relatively large box. On your left, you can see teacher's guides. These are meant to help teachers incorporate treaty understandings into their everyday teachings. You can see some puppets, you can see some stuff. So that's what the kit is. What I want to focus on, because this is a geography theme presentation, I want to focus on the resources in the kit that speak to a geographical perspective in the numbered treaties. One thing that speaks to a geographical perspective are the lesson plans themselves. The grade 10 document, because it reflects Manitoba curricula, is a geographic exploration of the treaty relationship here in Manitoba. And there are specific lesson plans that have students look at First Nations traditional territories and urbanization. So we have the opportunity to offer students, a geographic lens looking at this relationship. You see them, again, not just in grade 10, you'll see lessons in kindergarten, in grade 5, in grade 12. So that's one of the things. You see a wealth of maps. And what I've cut and pasted, these are some of the maps that are in the Treaty Education Kit. If you look on the left, that map was the map we were talking about, a traditional First Nations community map. The big map in the center says, "We are all treaty people." This is the slogan of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, shows the numbered treaties in Manitoba. On the far right, you can see a map of the numbered treaties here in Canada. So these are some of the physical resources that are in the kit to offer a geographic perspective. Another thing that teachers, both informal and formal educators, have here in Manitoba, we have a teacher's portal. So the portal is online. You can see I cut and pasted the URL, www.trcm.ca. And if you click on TEI, there is a wealth of resources for incorporating treaty learnings into your classroom. Again, formal or informal. I want to share with you one of our more recent resources that are found in the kit, and it is a printable tiled map. And what is a tiled map? Well, you see the image in front of you. It is, as the name implies, it is a tiled map. What you do, you get a file and you print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, what is there? You know, 4 times 4. There's 16 separate sheets, you know, 8.5 by 11. You print them on your computer and you have a giant map of treaties here in Manitoba. So what you can do is engage your students, or even your club if you teach Girl Guides, in a larger, you can look at a map in a big scale. This is supported by a number of learning activities. And what you want to do with an activity like this, you don't want just people to study a map. You don't want your learners to do that. We have different activities where you have the kids, you know, put, whether it be bingo chips on different areas. You have them, you know, look for Cree communities. You have them look for Dakota communities. You have them find out what treaty area are you in. You know, if you live in Portage la Prairie, Manitoba, what treaty area are you in? If you live in Thompson, Manitoba, what treaty area are you in? So this is a valuable resource, again, extending a geographic perspective to teachers and learners and communities as well. And it's kinesthetic. You know, I come from a classroom background. It's nice to have people doing something. So this is another one of our newer resources at the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. Before I go on, I want to go back, and forgive me for hopping around. This project was in cooperation with the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. The Royal Canadian Geographical Society are the publishers of Canadian Geographic magazine. One of their big projects that is coming out, and this is another thing, remember I mentioned the natural resources map a little while ago. One of their big projects that Canadian Geographic is doing is that this summer they will be publishing an Indigenous Atlas of Canada. And this is also part of the 150 commemoration celebrations that we're having as Canadians this summer. So there are wonderful resources, and maps tell a rich and detailed story. So it's going to be the Indigenous Atlas of Canada, and it's on the docket as well as a celebration of Canada's Indigenous past, heritage, and future. We started today talking about what is where. You know, where are the treaties? The numbered treaties, where are they located? We talked about why there, you know, why is Treaty 1 where it is, why is Treaty 2 where it is. And we talked a bit about, you know, why care? Why is it important? Why care? I told you that these are the 3 portals to inquiry in a geographic lesson. I thought I'd share with you one thing. Part of the Treaty Education Initiative is that we have been in schools all over Manitoba teaching teachers, teaching principals, teaching students, and many school divisions have embraced the entire concept of treaty education. And I was doing some research the other day, and this comes from the Seven Oaks School Division in Winnipeg. And this is something that they had at Leland North School in Winnipeg. And they had treaty days. And this is the why care. And the kids spent several days looking at treaties, the treaty relationship, you know, what is where, why there, why care. And when I was researching on Seven Oaks School Division's website, I came upon these 2 quotes. And at the end of the day, I think about students, and these are from the students. This week I learned that we are all treaty people. It doesn't matter whether we're born here or not. We are still part of the Canadian treaties because we live on the land. Here's another student. When I look at people in the world, I feel like we're all connected, and I feel like everything could change with just a handshake. I told you my background is in teaching, and I always have faith in our kids. A good friend of mine a few years ago said that our kids taught us how to recycle. In my house, this is the case. Our kids taught us how to wear seat belts. And I often give faith to our kids, you know, our learners, whether they be K to grade 12, to move us forward in a good way, in a relationship that we come from. So I really wanted to share this. This is the why care. And in exploring the past, whether a geographic perspective or a historical perspective, emboldens and enlightens our future voters, our students. The last slide I'm going to show you today is, and I'm not going to go over it, it's just if you have interest in further research, I've cut some. Some of it is defining geography, the numbered treaties. If you want more information, I've cut and pasted the TRCM's website, Indigenous and Northern Affairs, Indigenous place names from the Canadian Museum of History, the significance of the First Nations traditional names map from MF NERC, and there's a really interesting guide to acknowledging traditional territory. And with that, folks, it was an absolute pleasure, forgive me, chatting with you over the last few minutes. I'm going to turn the floor back over to our moderators.
Thank you so much, Connie, for an excellent presentation. We did have a couple questions from participants, so maybe I can read the first question to you if you'd like to respond, or we can share that response. The first one came from Shirley. She asked, how does the province of Manitoba get created before a treaty was written?
Hi, what a great question. That's a super question. So how did the province of Manitoba, that's a good question. When Canada became a country in 1867, what the government did shortly thereafter was buy all the land, purchase all the land in Western Canada from the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company had come in and essentially taken the land by 1670. So all of Western Canada, including Manitoba, was under the jurisdiction and the ownership of the Hudson's Bay Company. So what the Bay did in 1869, they went to the Canadian government and they sold it. The next year, you know, and if you look at the Riel resistance and that, but by 1870, that's how. And by 1871, so there is a bit of a weird, that's a really good question, of trajectory and dates. I have to tell you a story. My students and I studied often the Hudson's Bay Company and their place here in Western Canada. And I said to the kids one time, I said the Hudson's Bay Company was the de facto government in Western Canada. And one of the kids said to me, well, Miss Wyatt, what does de facto mean? And I said, well, you didn't have to listen to them, you just did because they were there. And one of the kids said, oh, like the mall cop. And I always got a chuckle out of that. That's a very good question.
Connie, there was another question. I think you might have answered it along the way from Audrey. She was asking about whose map is this? And she may have been referring to the treaties one or the Manitoba First Nations one.
Forgive me, I'm just unmuting my microphone again. Yeah, the one with the traditional place names is a Manitoba map. That's right, Cynthia, that's the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Center map. The other map comes from the federal government. And I believe they're clipped at the back here too, if you're interested, and thank you.
Another that came from Sylvia in a question whether the Treaty Commission has ever considered putting up signage on roads to let travelers know when they're moving in and across different treaty territories.
What a wonderful idea. I have not heard that, Cynthia. Have you? And maybe Cynthia can speak to it too, but that's a fantastic idea. The teacher in me, Sylvia, thank you very much, sees that instantly as a student project.
At this point, I'm not aware of specifically any work in that area, but it certainly could be a great partnership with the province of Manitoba. Excellent idea, one that we'll take back to the commission table.
Yeah.
And Connie came. Can you confirm which treaty Medicine Hat is a part of?
I'm glad you asked that, and I can't at this point. I have no map in front of me, and that's a really good question, Sandy. I really appreciate that. And I see some will use Treaty 7 and some will use Treaty 4, so at this point I would be afraid to confirm it.
Thanks, Connie.
Thank you for your question, though.
I'm just looking at the map, the treaties map. It could could be in Treaty 6, possibly Treaty 4 area. I'd have to see a more detailed geographic map. But getting back to the question about the treaty territory signs in Manitoba, Amanda, who works with the Treaty Relations Commission, said that the Commission has started discussions with the airport authority around that. As visitors are greeted to the city of Winnipeg, but there hasn't been any movement in the last little while. So just a last comment on that. The other piece, Connie, a question comes from Jessica about what do you think the statement means, we are all treaty people.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, the slogan of the TRCM is "We are all treaty people," and in Manitoba, especially in Winnipeg, there was a large advertising campaign on billboards and on the sides of buses and whatnot. And I think it speaks to the heart of the treaty relationship, in that treaties are not something that speaks specifically only to signatories of treaties or Indigenous people, but it speaks to all people in Canada, especially in the area of Treaties 1 to 11, where we came to share this land in a good way because of that treaty relationship. So the fact that it means that we are all treaty people doesn't mean that we have a status card. It means that we are beneficiaries of a relationship that was started, hopefully in a good way, to share and grow what we have as a Canadian nation.
Thank you, Connie. There's another question around Canada celebrating its 150th birthday this July. In what ways were the numbered treaties integral to Canada's Confederation in 1867?
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. As a teacher, and I mean, my background is teaching history, I can't imagine teaching Canada's Confederation without looking at treaties. They're not something separate. In my view, Confederation, and you see, we had a picture earlier of John A. Macdonald, and we saw some images and maps and that. The fact that the Canadian government engaged in the treaty process with Indigenous people starting in 1871 is important as an integral as the British North America Act of 1867. The treaties are part of Canada's process of becoming a nation, and very often they've been treated as add-ons and extra, and I would contend that it is part of the process. There would be no Western Canada without a treaty relationship. I see Lois has a question there, and it says, how and when were treaty borders defined? My understanding is that treaty borders, and that's a really good question, Lois, thank you for that. Because think of, traditional borders, if there were any, or lands, could be markedly different. They would have been defined by treaty commissioners at the time. When? At the time of the treaty signing, whether it be 1871, 1875.
And another question from Jessica, acknowledging that a number of institutions across the country are starting to make verbal land acknowledgement to Indigenous groups who traditionally occupy the territory. Do you see this as a step towards reconciliation?
I might throw that out to our participants. So if you didn't hear Cynthia, friends, she asked, I mentioned traditional territory acknowledgements. Do you see this as a step towards reconciliation? Does anybody out there want to comment on that? I see John's typing, and Sylvia. So we might just wait a minute, Cynthia, and see what our friends have to say.
Okay, in the meantime, there's a question from Sandy. How can I get the treaty education kit for our own education coordinator?
Maybe I'll if that's fine, Amanda is here. And Amanda is, if you go on the TRCM website and you click on education, Amanda Simard is the education manager. So I suspect, Cynthia, the best way would to be to outreach to the education manager in Winnipeg.
Yes, that's a good idea, Connie. So they can visit the TRCM website and connect with Amanda Simard, the education manager.
I see two questions there. Thank you very much, Cynthia. I see one from John. In the previous webinar, did you describe the treaty-making process prior to Confederation? And if I recall, Cynthia, you spent quite a bit of time on the treaty process as it existed, because it certainly did. Today we focused on the numbered treaties prior to Confederation and the numbered treaties.
Yes, that was one of the previous webinars. I did speak to the pre-Confederation historic treaties, and that started in the East, and also and those were the peace and friendship treaties that started in 1725 to 1779, and also the peace of neutrality treaties in 1701. Plus, and the Upper Canada treaties starting in 1781 rather, and the two Robinson treaties of 1850, and then the far west coast 14 Douglas treaties that spanned from 1850 to 1854. So that's a whole nother subject for sure, and possibly you could visit the link to the previous webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. And thank you for your questions. I see Noreen writes oral understanding of treaties needed. I know much of our materials that we've penned for the Treaty Education Initiative looks very much at oral history, elders, knowledge keepers, the spirit and intent of treaties. Absolutely. Yeah, I see yours, Karen. What a great point. The resources on traditional lands and urbanization of traditional lands would be a good resource for municipalities. I wonder if we could get a partner with the Association of Manitoba Municipalities. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, there's lots to learn and grow in many different areas. I see Sylvia wrote, and we were talking about verbal land acknowledgments. And Sylvia, that's a good point. It's a first step. There's a long way to go. And as long as we don't think, that we're there, we'll be continuing down the road. And thank you for that. Thank you, John. I see Sherry's typing.
Connie, as we're coming near the end, maybe I'll let you handle this last question from Sherry.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the CAUT guide is not without fault. It is a guide, and I don't know how recently it's been penned. And there are some things that are left out in that. So I look at a lot of things that are still growing and in need of editing. But I guess, Sherry, it's a first step. But I appreciate your comment.
Our time has come to an end. I'd just like to thank you for fielding the questions and to the participants who were very engaged in the process. So thank you so much, everyone, and I'll turn it back to Jessica.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Connie, for your presentation on a geographical perspective on the numbered treaties and in Canada. And thank you, everyone, for such a rich conversation. And this is how we can start educating more Canadians on treaties and treaty history. The more we know, the farther we can go. Thank you, Cynthia, for joining me as co-host today. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And thanks to everyone who viewed and participated in today's webinar of the Treaties and the Treaty Relationship webinar series. I would really appreciate if everyone could take a few minutes to complete our feedback survey. I will just share the link with you now. This link will also be a part of the email you'll receive in a few days with the recording of today's webinar. And with that, I would like to wish everybody a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us.